stock car racing sprang up in a hard scrabble part of the United States where rough and tumble was the way of life. Harold Osmer, Automotive Book Reviews. He crashed me, so I crashed him back. Now, this is a 2010 book, so it's a few years old. But it's relevant because our buddy, Cale Yarborough, recently passed away. Now, he was old and it was expected. He had a long illness, the whole thing. My first connection with NASCAR, I was 9 years old, living in Virginia, listening to NASCAR races on the radio with my dad in the den. Dad was a Ford guy. Cale Yarborough at the time was driving for the Wood Brothers, the 21 Ford. I became a Ford guy. I have a 66 Galaxy in the garage outside. There's a link here somewhere that'll show you. I'll put it in the comments there. This book is from 2010, as I say, by Mark Bechtel. There's links for all three of these books in the comments, by the way, and be sure to leave your comments below. This book recounts the 1979 season for NASCAR. Now, NASCAR had been around already for 20 years by the time 79 season rolled around. What happened that time was when Cale Yarborough got into it with the Allison brothers on the last lap of the Daytona 500 in front of God and Ronald Reagan and everybody else. And anyways, that was the big start of modern NASCAR. The pull quote, the wonderful pull quote where the title comes from, allow me, here we go. He crowded Yarborough down the track, hoping he could hold him off with a mile or so that stood between him and glory. Yarborough, down near the apron, was running out of asphalt. They ran side by side, each waiting for the other to back down in a strange game of chicken. Neither blinked. They touched, sending Yarborough even farther down the apron. Yarborough slid up, and they hit again, harder. The first tap might have been incidental. This one wasn't. I was going to pass him and win the race, Yarborough said years later. But he turned left and crashed me, so hell, I crashed him back. If I wasn't going to get back around, he wasn't either. And that was the nature of stock car racing in its formative years, let's call it, the first 2 decades of NASCAR. Somebody gets into you, you get into them. They were racing for position so that they could win enough money to get enough tires and fuel for next week's race. That's all it was about. Big money hadn't come into the show yet. And it was a wonderful time. And this is a retelling, race by race, throughout the 79 season. It's a wonderful book that does that. It draws these stories out, how television came into play and the marketing people came into play to bring NASCAR from its southern roots, out into the mainstream of national attention. They had a big snowstorm and the whole thing. All those stories come into play. Many of you, I'm sure, are already aware of those type of things. So this book goes race by race, tells you about it, talks about Waltrip and Pearson and Petty and Allison's, and Kyle Petty was just coming on as a rookie. Dale Earnhardt was really just getting started at this point. Earnhardt would have rather been hunting than racing. He had to race so he could afford to go hunting. If anybody went hunting and he heard about it and he didn't get to go, he was mad at them for that more than the racing, because it was just a way for him to make some money on the side. In many ways, a lot of fans my age, early 60s kind of range, we're starting to feel a little pushed out by NASCAR in the modern era, as it were, because we still remember these days. We can recall those days as a 9-year-old sitting in the den, listening to the races on the radio and imagining all these wonderful things going on in your head. And the drivers themselves just scraping by, trying to get from one track to the next. Hopefully they can make enough money to be able to afford to run the next race, that kind of thing. And that's what this book is about. And it tells that story. And I had to bring this one out because that particular incident that brought NASCAR into the big world is directly a tale of Cale Yarborough and the times. This book does a great job talking about just that very thing. Let me put that one aside. Got another one for you here. There are 3 here today. So here's the second one. This one is put out. It's essentially a NASCAR publication. NASCAR, 75 years. They brought it out last year. This is a great year-by-year book. It starts at the very beginning. Oh, man. This one, in contrast to the other one, has a ton of pictures. And you can see all this wonderful stuff from the Torinos. Oh, I love the Torinos, a Ford guy. Did I say that already? And the Dodges and Oldsmobile and all the characters. And the cars were all different. You could tell one from another as they came up through the ranks and all that. It was a wonderful time. And this book does a great job of going year by year, talking about specifically how the sport developed, why it went the ways that it did, the different rule changes that came into play. It's not a blow-by-blow type of recounting of each season, but it does give you a good feel. It's broken down by decade, and the key incidents that happened in those times that explains how NASCAR became what it is today. Now, something that happened along the way is that NASCAR was a local sort of thing. The first couple of races in NASCAR is what I was alluding to before. First couple of races in NASCAR didn't even take place in the South. The big races were up in the North. That's okay. You can find that in the book. Anyways, mostly an East Coast thing, mostly in the South. The book does a great job of talking about that. There are loads of pictures. They don't dodge around the crash shots either, which is good. A lot of books do that. Talks about the hazards involved and the safety things that came about and all of that. And it's wonderful. I got to tell you, though, NASCAR kind of lost me a couple of years ago. Kyle Larson is one of those guys. He throws back to the early days of Yarborough, Allison, Petty, David Pearson, early favorite. Ford guy. Hey, Larson's not a Ford guy, but I don't care. Not that much, anyway. Kyle Larson's in that same mode of all he wants to do is race. Put me on the track, man. I want to beat them guys on the track. Let me go race. And he'll race anything. And he goes down to the local level and races at the local level. That's why you'll see him at sprint car races. Hell, he runs Turkey Night. Runs those midgets. He gets out there. And that puts him as close to the fans as you can possibly get. Now, NASCAR does a decent job of getting the fans involved, but nowadays, the drivers at a NASCAR race are isolated from Joe Fan because they got so many corporate people hanging around them. The money just made it stupid. All right? It's my take on that. I also think that it was roughly 15 years ago, let's call it, give or take, where NASCAR they got different people involved in the upper realms of it and in the marketing game, and they started playing to the crowd they wanted instead of the crowd they had. Me, you. We're the ones they had. We're the ones that got them there. We're the ones that took them through the 80s and into the 90s, and they were huge. And then later on, they started playing to a different crowd and then turned off the rest of us. Sea to shining sea. You interested in NASCAR history? You really owe it to yourself to find one of these books. Done by Ken Clapp with Bones Boursier, who's pretty good at chronicling all these things from people like Ken Clapp himself, who's really good at talking and lacks the patience to sit down and write stuff out. That's not what Ken does. Ken was a people person. He was a West Coast guy for NASCAR, and he organized and staged races and promoted races, tons of open wheel stuff and stock car stuff and everything else. And he was at NASCAR in the very early formative days, and he talks about it in this book. He's got to be in his 80s by now, and this book can be a little heavy to read because there's a lot of stories involved here, and it's very detailed stories. But it's the stuff that Ken Clapp remembers, and Ken was there in the beginning. And if you're a big fan of NASCAR, this is the one that will give you the most insight of probably any other book. And mind you, I've got one or two books here. This one is very detailed in that. If you get past, I found myself reading this one and getting a little bogged down after the first couple of chapters. But soon as I got the feel of how it was being presented, and I'm just listening to a guy tell me stories, it came around and it made it easy to just whiz through the rest of this. And it's a pretty good sized book. Not a lot of pictures. There are some, but not a lot. It's mostly text. But it's valuable text. It explains how NASCAR became what it became, who the people were involved, he names names, and how they got to doing what they do to become NASCAR. In the end, and I had it marked, but I lost the thing, and I don't care anyway. Ken mentions, he says he can go to a race now, and he's welcome at the race. But nobody knows he's there. And that's kind of what's happened with NASCAR these days. It's become a bit of a, I don't know, a bit of a modern show that people all want to be a part of, but they don't care about the history any longer. Oh, they'll give it lip service, but that's as far as it goes. Everybody wants to be seen. Everybody wants to be part of the in crowd. That's not what NASCAR was about. You go back to these early days, where's that other one? That one that's on the floor there. You go back to these early days, David Pearson, geez, Bobby Isaac. Oh, I like Bobby Isaac, the bright orange K&K Dodges. Oh, love that stuff. These are guys that came out and raced. They all knew each other. They'd fight with each other, and then they'd share a ride on the way back home to Asheville or wherever they were going because they said they would. Yeah, I said I'd give him a ride home. Doesn't matter that he tried to kill me on the racetrack. And that's just how it was. And that's what we all came to NASCAR for. That exact kind of thing. There wasn't anything phony about going out there and risking your life on the racetrack. Now we have cars that all look alike, pretty much all drive alike, and drivers who all sound alike. Sounds like kind of a bummer there. Hey, but if you want to know about NASCAR, these are the 3 books you should really get. He crashed me, so I crashed him back. It's a quote out of the book there. And the NASCAR 75 Years book. There are links for all of these in the bottom. And then the latest one, which just came out a year or so ago by Ken Clapp, who was the VP of marketing for NASCAR. And I'm sure none of these guys are going to be real happy about what I had to say, but I hope it's valuable to you guys as fans of NASCAR. It can be a little frustrating, but that's how it is with any relationship that we have. And a relationship with a sport which we feel so passionate about, yeah, it hits home. Then we'll get by. Hey, there's Harold Osmer with Automotive Book Reviews.